Welcome to the current session here. The presentation will be on the Red Billed Fire Finch, obviously a very cool and cute bird. One of my favorite things about the AFA Conference is that it's not just about parrots. We love parrots, obviously, but there are a lot of other birds out there that are fantastic, and somebody needs to make an introduction for us so that we can really appreciate them. I want to read a little short bio here, but I do need to put my glasses on, and I want to get it right, so here we go. So Josef Lindholm, he's the Curator of Birds at the Tulsa Zoo since November of 2011. He has been the Curator of birds at the Tulsa Zoo, where he oversees the growing collection of more than 100 taxa of birds, as well as several species, mostly small mammals. He began his full-time career in aviculture in 1989 with 2 years at Jerry Jennings' collection when it was still at the Walnut Acres Aviaries near Los Angeles, assisting in its relocation as the Emerald Forest Bird Gardens near San Diego. Now listen to this resume here. He was then at the Fort Worth Zoo for 7 years, at Disney's Animal Kingdom for a year, at the Cameron Park Zoo in Waco for 4 years, and the Dallas World Aquarium for nearly 7 years. Nice resume. He has written for every chapter of the AFA Watchbird since 1991. That alone. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. As well as for the Avicultural magazines and other journals, and contributed to chapters of several books. So without further ado, please help me welcome Josef Lindholm III.
These are George Washington's golden pheasants that were given to him by the Marquis de Lafayette in 1786, and they died in 1787. Since 1914, these two birds have been part of the collection of a Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. The person who preserved them is Charles Willson Peale, who opened a museum in 1784 that existed until 1849. You can see he's very proud of his museum. In a moment, he would show you the first mounted mastodon, which he put together in 1802, and behind him are part of a 1,800 species of birds, which he pioneered in taxidermy. He also painted George Washington from life 8 times, and those paintings are in the museum also. Along with 1,800 dead birds and many reptiles and mammals and fishes, he also kept live animals. There was a grizzly, a bald eagle, there were some monkeys, and some more distinguished things. The magpie in the middle of a picture was painted from a stuffed specimen, but it had been alive when it came to Peale's museum. After 2 months at the White House, Thomas Jefferson kept this magpie and a prairie dog at the White House in an uncompleted room after Lewis and Clark had shipped it from North Dakota down the Missouri River to St. Louis, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, around the coast of Florida and up the eastern seaboard into Chesapeake Bay and Washington, D.C., and then it went overland to Philadelphia and died about 3 months later. But that was the first recorded North American magpie, and all the scientists and zoologists, including President Jefferson, were fascinated that America had a bird that was almost identical to a European magpie. And that was in the year 1805. The same year, a Frenchman, Soissons, donated a collection of living African birds to Peale's museum, along with a hippopotamus skull and a bunch of masks. Scarlet ibises were part of his collection of African birds. Of course, we know scarlet ibises aren't African. It was an unfortunate result of what was known as the triangle trade at that time, where New England slave traders would go to Africa, bring back captive people, trade them in the West Indies for sugar, which they would then take to back to Massachusetts and make rum out of, and then they would do the whole thing over again. So it was called the Triangle Trade. And so obviously the scarlet ibises came from the West Indies, but the other birds in this collection, crown heron, today we would call a crowned crane, but back then they called them crowned herons. There were widow birds, which we know today as paradise and pin-tailed whitus, and then there was something called a Senegal finch, which, there are a lot of finches in Senegal, but back in 1805 it would specifically mean the Red Billed Fire Finch. And so we have an instance of this species first being exhibited in the United States in Philadelphia 210 years ago. This picture is from a book that was also, the first part of it was published in 1805 at the height of the emperor. Napoleon had just declared himself emperor, and people in France were all very pleased to have gotten through the revolution and the terror and the guillotinings and all of that. And so it was a time to make fantastic looking, gorgeous books. And an ornithologist named Villot published a book on keeping foreign cage birds to celebrate the fact that France was now prosperous and happy again. And it's an amazing book. This is the facsimile copy that was published at a limited edition in 1979, which I was able to pick up a copy for about $80, and you can still find copies online for about $100 of a 1979 reprint. But it's just a lavish 210-year-old book, and covers a lot of the well-known cage birds, which were already available to people 210 years ago, and some that are not so well-known. Actually, crimson seed crackers were something Velo only had read about, and he never actually got to see a live one. Australia was still pretty much unexplored territory then, but oddly enough, one of the few Australian species was the beautiful firetail that people were able to get their hands on then, and the diamond sparrow. They also had zebra finches, but not the Australian zebra finch we're familiar with. This is the Timor zebra finch, which is kept in aviculture today, but much rarer than an Australian zebra finch. The island of Timor was an important stopping point when people depended on ships going across the Pacific, and so here's a Timor sparrow and a Timor parrotfinch, or Forbes parrotfinch, which is a very valuable bird today in today's aviculture, that they had it 210 years ago. Vilo presented this bird as the red Senegalese, and that was what he called a firefinch. But actually, this is not the firefinch that we are familiar with today. Well, it is available. You can get blue-billed firefinches, which are also confusingly called African firefinches. All firefinches come from Africa, and this is not the most widespread one. But this species, with its dark beak and rather larger size and grayish head, you can, in fact, obtain it now from importers, but it's not the one that I'm talking about today. Instead, Vilo referred to this bird as the little red Senegalese. And this particular painting is of a bird that he had bred in his aviaries sometime before 1805. So we have a first captive breeding record of this particular species of African finch. Vilo went into quite a lot of detail about how to raise these birds, and aside from the fact that the temperature needed to be maintained at 88 degrees, pretty much everything else he said then applies today, and you'll be able to read that in some installments in Watchbird. One thing that was he emphasized was that firefinches need to have feathers to build their nests, and if you don't give them feathers, they will go and pull them off of other birds and each other. So I thought that was quite amusing in light of the fact that we budget every year to buy feathers from the craft store, which we have our vets sterilize for several weeks, and they all go like popcorn when we put them out in the aviaries and get incorporated into nests. This is the menagerie at Versailles, which Louis XIV built in the 1600s. Large yards all around a central observation building, and quite an impressive collection of birds for the 17th and 18th century. And in 1726, the first fire finches that we definitely know to have arrived in Europe came there. They were the donation of the then 72-year-old director of the Royal Senegal Company, which was one of the first colonial organizations, to the then 16-year-old Louis XV, the King of France. Dr. Hopkinson was an amazing historian of aviculture, and he spent from 1901 to 1929, he was stationed in the Gambia on the west coast of Africa as a colonial officer, but he also wrote an enormous number of articles and books on the longevity of birds and first captive breedings, and collected all kinds of obscure information, including how finches were brought to France in 1726, and from that account he was able to identify 3 species. The indigo bird, or comboso, which is this one here. This is the natural brood parasite of the red billed fire finch, and is still available today at very inexpensive prices through importers. And then, of course, the West African red-cheeked cordon bleu is still a familiar bird today. And the red billed fire finch, those were the 3 species of Senegal birds that were presented to the King of France in 1726 by the Royal Senegal Company. Some years later, we had mass imports of birds to Europe. 1869 was when the Suez Canal was opened between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and that facilitated worldwide ship traffic. Birds coming from West Africa didn't have to go that direction, but at any rate, in the 1870s, there was a tremendous amount of wild cage bird trafficking to Europe, and modern aviculture pretty much came into its own then. This was a building that existed during those dates in Berlin. It had a piano wire front and was one of the first modern-looking zoo exhibits. And by 1870, the red-billed fire finches had already been bred repeatedly in Germany and Holland. The first English breeding didn't happen until 1898. David Seth-Smith was curator of birds at London Zoo for many, many years, and editor of Avicultural magazine on and off also for many years, and was also the first zoo person to go on the BBC, and basically was a precursor to Marlon Perkins and David Attenborough and all these other people who go and talk about zoos on the media. But he was the editor of the Avicultural magazine when a 6-foot-tall English clergyman, who apparently was rather scary-looking, came into his office to discuss something he didn't like about the Avicultural magazine, and they departed the best of friends. But Seth-Smith initially was rather alarmed because the Reverend Charles Farrar was always arguing with people in the Avicultural magazine about who bred what and how it was done, and but he wrote a uncharacteristically very short article on breeding red-billed fire finches, where he basically said most people spend all of their time trying to keep fire finches alive, and that's all they do. But he had brought in 10 birds, kept them without heat indoors over the winter, and produced a single chick in 1898. Shortly afterwards, people were breeding them in 1899 and 1900, and there are quite a few accounts in the Avicultural magazine after that. 1923, the Avicultural magazine published a series of articles on keeping finches, and this was one of the plates by a very famous bird illustrator, Hendrik Gronwald, who He's well known as an ornithological technical illustrator, but he also did things for the Avicultural magazine. And at any rate, by the 1920s, Red Billed Fire Finches were considered the easiest of all the African finches to breed in captivity. There was a Frenchman whose article accompanied this plate, and Decoud considered it just simply the easiest African waxbill to breed. And so by the 20s, in England and France and other parts of Europe, it had become a very commonly imported bird. The gentleman is Edward Boosey, who, with his partner, Alec Brooksbank, ran the Keston Foreign Bird Farm in England from the 1920s into the 1960s. I don't have any pictures of Mr. Brooksbank because he was always on the other side of the camera. Very well-known photographer. And let's see, I think Boosey did the cover illustration here. He painted, Brooksbank took pictures, but the two of them developed all sorts of new budgie breeds and accomplished all sorts of first breedings, including a lot of parrots and other things, but they were very fond of finches as well. This is the classic little book that should have been published in 1939, but World War II broke out, so it didn't get published till 1949. And some of one of Brooksbank's pictures here. Later, when Boosey wrote a book, Brooksbank's color photos accompanied it, and these are classic color bird pictures, which you've probably seen reproduced quite a few other places. And the caption here is, as it says, good liberty birds, and they look delightful in a garden. And that was one thing that Brooksbank and Boosey promoted. Acquiring birds and turning them loose in your English garden during the summer, and then trapping them all up and keeping them over the winter. And they did this extensively. It was quite a popular thing in England in the 20s and 30s to bring inexpensive African finches home and turn them loose in your yard. And as long as you didn't have cats or owls, these several species, lavenders, cordons and fires, would all usually stay around and breed in the garden, and then you could trap them all up and keep them warm during the winter. Hastings, William, Saxville, Russell, Marquis of Tavistock, and 12th Duke of Bedford was passionate about turning birds loose. He would turn all sorts of rare cockatoos and macaws and other things loose on the various estates and places that he owned over the years. And it's amazing, all the birds he turned loose, not often a very good success, but he's especially well known for having written a book on parrots, which was republished several times. But he was also very fond of finches, and he wrote an article for the Avicultural magazine, which you'll find later in Watchbird, where he advocated acquiring freshly imported finches, turning them out loose in the summer in your garden, and then trapping them all up, at which point they would be acclimated birds and you could then sell them. But he was always giving practical advice like that. Here he is with his free-flying budgies, which was a particular passion of his. And in 1953, he had hawks going after his budgies, so he took a fowling piece and went out and disappeared, and it took 3 days to find the body stuffed in a hedge, where apparently he had been climbing through the hedge with his gun and it went off. So he died indulging his hobby of turning birds loose. World War II put an end to people turning birds loose in their gardens or keeping birds in general. Actually, Brooksbank and Boosey turned all their fire finches loose at the beginning of World War II. Since they couldn't afford bird seed anymore because of the rationing, and a lot of them hung around in barns around the Keston Bird Farm for quite a while, but we don't know what eventually happened to those. But by the mid-1950s, English aviculture had recovered. This is another classic book that was also published in the United States with another classic bird painter, Vowles, who illustrated a lot of things in the 50s, but no one really knows much about him now. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. But at any rate, about this time, the Australians really started to do well breeding fire finches. And so during the 50s, actually, the Australians were not able to bring any birds into Australia after 1948. So because they had a Newcastle's problem and had a complete bird embargo. So from 1948 onwards, the Australians started a self-perpetuating population of red billed fire finches, with the results that today you can buy a pair in from a breeder in Australia for about $40 US a pair, and if you go to a pet shop, it'd be about $80 US a pair. The only fire finches that you can get in the States pretty much are imported birds, and they cost about $55 each, or $110 a pair. So the Australians have completely established their birds. Once the English avicultural scene recovered in the 50s, they also eventually established fire finches. In 2004, there was 2005, there was a bird flu scare which caused England and all of Europe to prohibit bird importations, and it became permanent in 2007. And with the result that people really put a lot of effort into breeding various sorts of finches. So today, an aviary-bred pair of red-billed fire finches in England would cost about the same as an imported pair in the United States, and in Germany, they're quite a bit less. They've hatched from about 2010 to 2014 over 600 fire finches were hatched just in the United Kingdom. In the meantime, in the States, the story was rather different. After the slave trade ended in 1808, there was very few African birds came to the United States. There were some ostriches and more crowned cranes and secretary birds and things that showed up at traveling circuses, but the small bird trade had pretty much ended as far as Africa and America were concerned. Instead, the Yankee traders were going to China, and so by the 1840s, when there was quite a vigorous American cage bird trade, the foreign finches came from Asia. Strawberry finches and Java sparrows, you could easily obtain them in Boston at the end of the 1840s, and they were popular cage birds. In 1848, an Englishman who ran a bird shop in Boston wrote a very useful book on cage bird keeping, and he mentioned, among other foreign finches, something that he called a Senegal finch, but he also called it a spice bird and said it came from Asia. So naturally, I thought he was talking about spice finches, but then when you read his description, he said it was smaller than a strawberry finch and had a red beak, and the color description's very strange. And what these Senegal finches, which the author thought came from Asia, actually were, appear to have been gold-breasted waxbills, which, when they're kept under poor conditions, as they would be when carried across the Atlantic from Africa to New England by sail ship in the 1840s, would end up being weird colors. And so there actually were African finches being brought in small numbers to New England, but by that time people thought they were Asian, and the original Senegal finch, the fire finch, had been completely forgotten, and those probably didn't make the trip. So it was not until our age of modern technology, the bird trade back in the 19th century in America was, if it wasn't Asian birds, there were also lots of European birds being brought in. And then at the time it was legal to own cardinals and painted buntings and all sorts of North American migratory birds. North American bird keeping didn't become, native bird keeping didn't become illegal until 1906, at which point we did start to see African birds show up again. Going to digress here very quickly. How are we for time?
You're doing great.
Great. Okay, a little bit of zoo history here. This is one of the oldest zoo bird houses. One of these pagodas still exist as the passenger pigeon and Carolina parakeet museum, because this is where the last passenger pigeon died in 1914 and the last Carolina parakeet died in 1918. It was also the place that first bred strawberry finches in the United States. And the Bronx Zoo in 1899 built a magnificent birdhouse, which is administrative offices today. They had an enormous number of cages, and they're very proud of how spacious they were, especially this one, which caused... the Avicultural magazine in England got a lot of nasty mail after a description of this cage was published there, because the English thought this was a horrible way to exhibit birds. The public couldn't tell them apart. There were too many, they would fight. It made no sense to keep birds like this. The little cages along here, that's how to properly exhibit finches in a zoo, at least by British standards back then. And the Germans did one up on it. This is the Berlin Zoo, and lots and lots of little cages. That's how you kept a big collection of small tropical birds in those days, and how you took care of them.
Wow.
This is all Berlin. That sign there, a very aggressive-looking sign that says "Keep Right," that was from the Nazi era, and in 1943, this building took a direct hit from a Allied bombing. Not all the birds died. Down here at the bottom of this list, if you can see words like zebra finch and Japanese muchin, which are society finches. This is a list of birds that they evacuated from Berlin to Mulhouse in occupied France and Poznan in occupied Poland. So it's definitely a tragic comic thing when you have Nazis carrying zebra finches and society finches, evacuating them out to occupied countries. Such is the madness of war. Back to the Bronx Zoo, which had the finest bird collection in the United States for many years. The first curator, the man on the right, William Beebe, eventually left off bird curating to do deep sea exploration and all sorts of other things. He continued to work for the New York Zoological Society, but he left the bird department in the capable hands of Lee Crandall. Bird people know him as a mammal person more than anything else. Not long before he died in the 1960s, he published Wild Mammals in Captivity, which is still a classic zoo person's work, but people forget that his main passion really was birds. Here he was in an expedition in New Guinea in 1929, collecting birds of paradise. But for people who know of Crandall from his massive book on zoo animals, it's a little surprising that back in 1917 he wrote a pet book, which you can still find online. Although the definition of what pets were back in 1917 is a little different from today, and you can read everything he had to say about firefinches is in this one paragraph, which is pretty much what people have continued to say for many years beyond then, that they don't import well. They come in and they die, but yes, this little bird is one of the most delicate in captivity, being very hard to establish. Even then, the greatest care is required to keep it in good health. So, and that was pretty much what people believed for a long time afterwards. This is part of one of the first of the lists that Crandall maintained, the first one with Beebe, of birds that they knew had been bred in the United States. And by 1929, only 11 species of estrildid finches were known to have been hatched in American zoos, and only one of those was African, and that was the cutthroat finch. When John Delacour visited Los Angeles and stayed there for about a month back in 1936, he was fascinated by what was going on in Southern California because large-scale aviculture had only started there in the 1920s, and by the 1930s it had exploded. There were people breeding tens of thousands of budgies every year, and there were all sorts of Australian finches being bred. But he found that African finches cost about 6 times as much as they did in Europe, and they were very rare. So back in the 30s, you already had lots of people breeding Gouldians and all sorts of other Australian finches and just mass-producing zebras, but hardly anyone was working with Africans. There was a budgie breeder, J.C. Edwards, who wrote about African finches in 1936, and I kind of gather from what he wrote that someone had already bred fire finches, although I don't have any clear record of a U.S. first breeding of fire finches till 1973. Edwards implied that someone had been breeding them in the 30s, but he said that really, why waste time with African finches when Australian ones are much easier to keep, they don't require live food, and you make more money. And that seems to have been the attitude pretty much ever since then as far as Australian versus African finches. John Delacour had a wonderful time visiting the States in 1936 and 1937. He had a less wonderful time coming over here in 1940 when the Nazis invaded France, and he had to leave his beautiful estate and private collection as a captain in the French army and evacuate with his troops, and then ended up with nothing to do once the French government fell, and managed to cross the Atlantic. First, he went to North Africa and then to Lisbon, and then arrived in New York. He said it was the first time he'd ever had to to earn money when he was 50 years old, and this is one of his installations at his own place at Clare in France. People think of Delacour as a pheasant and waterfowl person, but he was also passionately fond of small birds. But at any rate, he ended up at the Bronx Zoo, and there he is with Crandall, and from 1940 to 1947, Delacour was technical consultant at the Bronx Zoo when he wasn't doing ornithology at the American Museum in New York. And he redesigned the Bronx Zoo's birdhouse and basically inaugurated the modern way that we exhibit birds nowadays. This arid plain exhibit, rather hard to see here, there's an Egyptian plover right there, and he kept a collection of African finches and other sorts of desert birds and California hummingbirds on this side, and then the New England garden on the other side. That's still about as modern as it gets in zoo design, and something that Delacour did in the middle of the Second World War. He also designed the Jewel Room, which was a very famous building in the Bronx Zoo until the World of Birds was opened in 1972. Completely different way of attractively exhibiting small tropical birds from the old style that we saw, where everything, as Delacour said, was lined up in cages on a shelf. And so he did this, and you can see the people standing against a finch exhibit. There was always quite a collection of different sorts of African finches kept in that big egg-shaped display there. After World War II ended, technology exploded, and by the early 1950s, enormous numbers of birds were being traded around the globe in a way that had not been done before. This is the earliest picture I've been able to find of a captive firefinch in the United States. This is from a 1953 National Geographic magazine article, which featured the birds that were for sale at a large sort of warehouse facility in Lower Manhattan, which belonged to the importer Louis Rua and Company. And if you worked for a zoo or you had a private aviary in the early 1950s, Louis Rua was the person you would buy cocks of the rocks or toucans or all sorts of other zoo quality birds from. And but they also dealt in all sorts of wonderful finches. You don't see green avidavits so much anymore, but At any rate, the photographer from the National Geographic, Dr. Paul Zoll, spent several days photographing birds for National Geographic at Rua's establishment. And this was the time when African finches suddenly became very common in American aviculture. And red-eared waxbills in the upper corner there, in the early 1960s, the second bird I ever owned was a red-eared waxbill that I got at the Sears Roebuck store for $3. And later I was able to convince my parents to let me get $3.98 pairs of red-eared waxbills and cutthroat finches and other things. All through the 60s and into the beginning of the 70s, African finches of some of the commoner varieties were all very cheap. You could almost always get them for $5 a pair. Most of them were very difficult to breed because they required aphids or other things, so hardly anyone bred them. Instead, they just bought them in large numbers. And one bird that didn't show up in large numbers, though, were fire finches because of their bad reputation for being bad shippers, and the fact that the one time when I worked in a pet store for 1 month, I ordered one pair of Red Billed Fire Finches, and the male died the day, and I think it came in DOA, so I learned my lesson. So fire finches, since they didn't stand being shipped in enormous numbers, were never as common or as cheap as red-eared waxbills and some of the other species. When they did come in, they would in small numbers, and they always cost more. San Diego Zoo converted a bird of prey aviary into this walk-through rainforest, which it still is today, in the early 60s, and back in 1961 they had exactly 100 species of birds in it, and up near the top you can, I think, see one fire finch in an aviary that also included toko toucans and all sorts of other large alarming birds, cocks of the rocks and anhingas and all sorts of things down there. We don't do things like that in zoos anymore, but in fact this was just after they opened the cage. A few years later, the dear old curator, Casey, was very proudly boasting, we had 1,000 birds in that aviary of 200 species. It was the funnest aviary anyone ever had. Bates and Busenbark, which is sort of the book Finches and Soft-Billed Birds, was pretty much the standard American book on finches for years. And they also, basically what they had to say about fire finches is that they didn't import well and had to be given special care after they arrived. And yes, they'd heard about some people breeding them. But as I said, the first breeding I'm absolutely certain of was at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. in 1973. In 1972, exotic Newcastle's disease quarantine was imposed, and all of a sudden, because of a 1-month quarantine, birds that had cost $3 suddenly cost $25, so there were no more $3.95 pairs of finches. Instead, a pair of red-eared waxbills would cost you $40, and people began to take things more seriously, so you can see it's only from the 70s onwards that zoos started breeding red-billed fire finches, and some of them actually did quite well. I'm pleased that the second best record here is Fort Worth, although we actually went 1 year beyond 96. 96 was when the International Zoo Yearbook stopped publishing these statistics for some reason. But in 97 we hatched 3 more, so we actually did 36 birds of 16 surviving, whereas San Diego did 35 of 16 surviving. So Fort Worth actually beat out San Diego. But when the Wild Bird Conservation Act passed in 1992 and was put into implementation in 1993, that completely cut off red-billed fire finches from being imported into